We get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
When you have these mice, you order them from a company, they're all genetically identical. They're highly inbred. So if you get a result like this, it is due to whatever you've injected and not due to the genetics in them. Now you might be like, Balint, if they're inbred, certainly there's things that are wrong with them to begin with, right? Because inbreeding is usually bad. There are inbreeding issues. For example, Gray, my favorite one was there was a learning and memory study done on mice, and the learning and memory study was done by playing a musical note and pairing it with electric shock. The researchers were like, we found this gene that if you get rid of, the mice, they don't remember and they're not afraid. And it turned out, Gray, it's because they were deaf. That was the inbreeding effect. The mice were deaf. So now there's actually a lot of controls you have to do for these experiments. You have to do a sample size that increase. Now, in mice, 5 usually is a good number. If you were to do this in fruit flies, you do hundreds. And that's in part because of money. Aging a mouse about $70 a day to feed them, clean their cages, give them fresh water, $70 a day. If we do 5 mice control, 5 mice experimental, and we age them to 28 months, that adds up very quickly. They're not necessarily clones. They still mate, and there's still some mutation that happens, right? But they're essentially genetically identical. So it's actually closer than a twin study. They're called super siblings, which is about 75% identical. And that's the same amount of genetic identicalness that you would get like from a bee or an ant colony. The reason it costs that much is because of the facility. So it has to be in a standardized setting. Light, dark cycles, humidity, 2 people taking care of them. It's usually their full-time job. There is also an animal facility that has a bunch of costs to make sure everything's standardized. So it's huge levels of buildup and cost that built in that adds up to be about that much a day. So it's not just that, you put them in a box in the corner of your house and you give them some wood chips and food and water, but it's like everything has to be standardized, clean. Also, they genotype them, meaning that they take like a small tail clipping and you do sequencing on them before you do the experiments. All of that's just like adding up, right? Weirdly enough, maybe not weirdly enough, I don't know, you can tell me if you don't think this is weird. You can order these mice from a place called Jackson Lab. That's what everyone does, because you're like, I want to do an experiment on a black 56 mouse. That's what was in this paper. I go to Jackson Lab and I order B56 mouse. I get it, great. What's wild is, Gray, to me, is that their diet also affects things. So the diet at the facility might be different than the diet at the lab that you have. And that could have an effect on your experiment. And actually that was discovered 10 years ago, where the microbiome was different because of the different diet. In papers, it says mice were fed standard diet. Fruit flies were fed standard fruit fly diet. But no one defines what that is. And so if your recipe is at all a little bit different, then you might have very different results. And it's like, ah! The Jackson Lab, Gray, we can actually go to the website if you want. Here's the website. You can search for mouse by strain, stock, gene, allele, synonym. Here are the featured strains. So it's like, here's your black 56. NSG. The tau is a protein that mutated causes Alzheimer's. It causes plaquelettes in the brain. And so that's one that's like heavily featured here. There's this K, and these are not mutations, right? The K18HACE2 is a particular mutational site. So, Gray, the idea is you can, in theory, order any gene mutated in the mouse, if it's not lethal. There are some genes, if you mutate in the animal, it just dies, right? So then you might have to make a new mouse where you turn it off in a time-controlled manner. So you allow it to develop, and then in the adult stage, you turn it off. But let's say you wanted B56. This is your wild type here. That's why I didn't go into mammal research, because I can't kill mammals. My dad was actually, he worked in mice, rats, opossums, and he had to kill them, and I was like, nope, I cannot do it. How did they do cancer tests with mice? You can mutate a gene and give them cancer. It's that easy. You can also you can transplant a human cancer into a mouse and it will have a tumor. They tend not to naturally get cancer until they're old. So what you'll usually do is you might do a targeted mutation in a group of cells. That's where you'd have the mutation form. Do these mice retire, and can people adopt retired mice? I don't know if you can adopt them. They do have what are called retired breeders. So you can buy an 89-week-old mouse, one mouse, Noki, for $546. One mouse. Now, Noki, these are retired breeders. So at a certain age, they no longer breed the mice and they just keep them alive because people might want to do an aging experiment. And can you imagine, we just talked about the price, right? So imagine, Noki, I want to do an experiment on an aged mouse. It's important for me that I do this experiment, otherwise I don't know if it's worth doing the experiment. Is it worth me taking 3 years or more to age a mouse and test? What if I'm wrong? You go onto this website and you can order them, test it, and see if you're right or not. So they're called retired breeders. There are laws in place about the welfare of these animals. So if you're worried about how they're kept, there are many laws in place on animal welfare. Density of the cage, for example, how often food is changed, how often water is changed, cleanliness of the cage. All these things are really at play. It is not allowed to have an animal suffer. And even when they're having to be put to sleep, it is done in the most humane way possible. This is all U.S. institutes have these what are called IRB protocols. And each university has one where they have to abide by both the NIH guidelines, which is the National Institute of Health, as well as the university guidelines to make sure that the animals are not abused in any way. And that doesn't extend to every animal. It's called higher order mammals, so you have your rats, your mice, your birds. No for any insect that I'm aware of. No for bacteria. No for cell lines. Monkeys will have it. So things like that have these guidelines, but insects do not. Yeah, and so then here's your website where you can order them from. So let's say for the experiment you wanted to have an older mice. Yeah, it's pretty expensive. But remember Draft Killer, how much each mouse costs a day to upkeep. Really, they're not making almost any of a profit here.